Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Lindsay Babe, Marketing Manager at Excellis Health Solutions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer in the upper right-hand corner. You can minimize the attendee interface by pushing the orange arrow at the top. You're listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. Please send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and then we'll collect them and address them during the Q&A session at the end. I would like to now introduce today's speakers. First, we have Brian Bechtold from SVA Consulting. He is the President and Principal. And we have Scott Pottiger, Vice President of Excellis Health Solutions.
Good afternoon, everybody on the East Coast, and good morning, everybody on the West Coast. Want to introduce myself, Scott Pottiger. I'm Vice President of Business Development and Marketing at Excellis. I've been here a little over 4 years, leading all of our BD efforts, strategic partnerships, and marketing. The 1-minute introduction on Excellis is that we're a strategic supply chain consulting company focused in the serialization, brand protection, and quality space, mostly the processes and systems. We like to say from make to take, which means that we work with all segments of the supply chain. This puts us in a unique position to work with virtuals and biotechs because we understand what your supply chain partners want, as well as what their systems are capable of doing. So we have that unique perspective and lens supporting our customers from strategy through sustainability, which we'll talk a little bit more about in future slides. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Brian to introduce himself and SVA.
Hello, everybody. This is Brian Bechtold. SVA BioOps is specialized in business transformation. So what we do is we help organizations sort of understand where they're at and where they need to go, and then how they actually prepare their organization for that change. Why we're so focused in the emerging life science space is because one of the larger changes organizations will make is going from an R&D company actually into a commercial organization. And there are so many things that have to occur to actually do that successfully. It makes it a really great place for us to bring our change management skills in and get organized for success. So that's SVA BioOps. We've been doing this for a while. We've had a lot of launches under our belt. We're excited to be here with all of you today. So when we think about launching great pharma companies, we really believe that there are just certain things you have to do to launch companies in general. One of the bigger things is that we have to make sure we have great controls in place. We have to plan for success at every turn. And so one of the things when you're thinking about building your organization, you have to believe you're going to be financially successful. You have to believe that you're going to make an impact on your clients' futures. And to do that, you need to make sure that you're in a prepared state to take advantage of it. Financial controls and making sure that your business is in a stable place is a great place to start. It allows you to make sure you're making your commitments to your shareholder community. It allows you to make sure that you have systems in place that can control quality on product through. So business management systems, financial controls are really critical. The other thing we believe in today's modern world is that you really have to have ownership of your data. When you take a look at the landscape out there, people are talking about things like data is the new oil and how valuable it can be to organizations. And so when companies are in early stage and before they're operating, really they have the opportunity to grab and hold and own and capture all their critical operating data so that they can really check the course of their organization through time, and they can aggregate it, put it in places, and then figure out how to use it later. It's the best way to be prepared for taking advantage of advancements in technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning, is you have to have just a wealth and a plethora of data to throw at those models. And then the other thing that we believe that organizations must have to be great at today is they must have to be great at change. Competitive advantages are very, very tricky things in the modern world. And many people are talking now that there's really only a transitive advantage to be gained for a moment of time. Organizations have to be built in a nimble way, and they have to understand how to change and how to change with quality to make sure that they can keep pace with what market demands are there and what the consumer is actually looking for. Change and quality sometimes fight against each other because quality is built on standards of stability and on standards of high repeatability, where change requires rapid innovation and rapid development. And so you really have to have good quality systems in place to make sure that you can change without having the risk of deprecating your brand around quality. So today we're going to kind of talk about those things in the context of what it takes to get from where you're at to commercialized. And we're going to talk about some timelines and some lessons learned. We'll talk about some base principles of how we build the business. We'll talk a little more about that as we go. And then really, kind of where to focus at what points in your journey. So all of you will likely be in different places in your timeline as you sit here today. And there'll hopefully be something for everybody as we can talk about, kind of where you're at, what you should be thinking about, and really what kind of planning steps you should be putting in place in order to get prepared for, your big day. So when we take a look at the timeline, and if you look at the top, and you'll see this repeated quite a bit, we've got a representation, a visual representation of kind of what is a typical series of events or milestones inside of a launch timeline. And what you'll notice is that we kind of heat map that as you're getting closer to your launch date, obviously things get more critical. And one of the things we'll be doing as we're talking through today is we'll talk about what are safe bets you could make away from that red period. Like when you get to that red time, the chaos goes up, the pressure goes up, the anxiety goes up, the stakes go up. And what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're focusing on what you can do away from that red period. So we're talking about launching a product. Well, you're really building a company. So you have to have an operating business to be able to transact business. And you're focused so much on launching the product, especially if it's your first product, that we really need to be thinking about building that company as well. It's interesting because that need to build is really laid against, what might be an uncertain future. So you may not have your clinical data back yet. You may not know, what the trajectory of your business is or the timeline. So you need to be able to build safely and in de-risked ways so that you can manage your cash appropriately and you can make your timeline without giving up too much equity. And of course, that order out of chaos, the longer we wait, the more chaotic it's going to be. And it's really good to be pre-planned so that when you get the news and it's time to go, you sort of know the steps that you're going to take to get on that journey. So being planful and creating some order is important. And then you're not alone. We've seen a lot of companies go through this. It's an exciting time because, you're building something new. And in this space, there's so many well-meaning people who are trying to impact patients' lives in so many meaningful ways that the excitement and energy is just crazy. So do the best we can for them by being very planful and organized while we can. Because when we get to that red period, it's going to be full out run. And it's exciting. So when we take a look at pre-launch activities, and we'll go in a little bit deeper detail on this on the next slide. But what you're going to do is you're going to see there's 7 really critical pre-launch activities that we have to build, and we consider these things vital business objectives. VBOs, as we call them, is something very special to SVA Consulting and SVA BioOps. And what it does is allows us to focus on the absolutely most important things that are critical to whatever transformational mission we're on. And in this case, it's building an emerging life science business. So when we look at the 7 critical pre-launch activities, they're going to be things that really get you to market. There's going to be market development. You're going to have to get your medical and scientific messaging up with medical affairs. You're going to have to do your promotional work, getting field force deployed, which is a feat of its own. You need to put quality management systems in because obviously You're going to have those to make sure you're doing the best by the patients, but also to make sure you get through your regulatory approvals. And then you've got a whole bunch of things that are really tied into what happens with serialization. And so we're going to be talking about 3PL selection. We got state licensing, all kinds of things. The whole point of this, and I'm just going to move the slide, or if we can move the slide, Lindsay. And one more, is that those 7 vital business objectives fan out into a series of things that have to be built inside of the business in order for the business to actually make that transition to commercialization and get product into patients' hands. And so what we try to do is we try to be very planful with how we go through, and of course this is the traditional Ishikawa diagram, but how we go through this fishbone and say, you know, what sort of tasks and capabilities have to be built by the business in order for us to satisfy and make sure that the vital business objective is in place when it's time for us to go live. And so this is something that we use with our clients, is kind of making sure that these are kind of the what needs to be done, making sure we're not missing anything, making sure we're focusing on all the things that are critical for launch success. And for the most part, most of these apply to most companies we find. So go ahead, Lindsay. And in total, there's 100 business capabilities that we track to build. One more back. There's 100 business capabilities that we track that have to be built. And there's actually 300 business components. And these are things like policies and SOPs, teams, process, hiring itself is crazy, all the systems that have to turn up. Really, you're taking, you know, when you talk about building your business while it's kind of flying, you really are. You're launching your product, but at the same time, you're launching business operations. And those things aren't always in the same kind of thought process or motions. You're actually building, 15 business functions. You're hiring people that are going to head those functions. Those people, when they come in, they're going to have very specific opinions how things have been done in the past. They're going to bring their history and experience in. That may or may not be congruent with your plan. And so how do we handle that change, and how do we handle that desire to make sure we're blending the best practices with what people bring with them, with what the direction and leadership is from the executive team of what needs to be built. All of that has to be kind of blended together into something that produces, a successful organization at the end that's capable of handling growth and capable of handling a product launch and capable of handling customer or patient concerns. How do we do that? There's a lot of people stuff on this. It isn't just the task list of what we have to check off to do, but it's also how do we get the people to agree on what's best and what's right. And when we have these conflicts and face-offs, how do we mitigate that for the betterment of the organization? So a lot of people stuff goes into the change management around building out these functions and these capabilities and these components. So it isn't entirely clinical. It isn't entirely perfect because there's people in the middle. Go ahead, Lindsay. So as we've talked about before, really, what are the safe bets, the things that we find across our client set that, things they could invest in early and have ready and have kind of in a place where they're going to build their business on it, and do it away from that red time. Do it away from that critical period when you absolutely must be focused on getting to market. You absolutely must be focused on how we're going to get the product out, get it known, and then eventually get it into patients' hands. So the things that we think or we find that clients are most successful with doing is kind of getting out of the way, is getting that quality management strategy in place to make sure that the organization from its inception point or as early as possible is really building on side of a quality base. That's going to pay huge dividends long term. The other thing we've got to be thinking about is the serialization strategy, because that's something that can take some very specific thought process to go through. It needs to be concentrated on, and expertise needs to be brought in. Financial controls set the organization up for success, making sure that when we take funding on, that we've got good proper controls to report back to those funding sources. Making sure that the shareholders of the organization, whether it's private or public, have the confidence in the management team that the organization is being run with financial oversight. And that confidence and efficacy will actually give them the ability to potentially fund more and more frequently. What business management systems are in place? Do you have a platform that you can trust, that you can put in place and that you can operate on, that doesn't break the bank, that doesn't actually burn too much cash too early in your organization, so that you're not able to spend funds on things that actually help with the product launch in a more successful way? So do you have a business management system in place capable of getting you to launch and through launch? And then really that data management strategy. How do you prepare your organization for the future and to take advantage of the advancing technology? Are you going to own your data? Are you going to use a lot of SaaS-based tools, different things that are out there in the quote-unquote cloud? How are you going to bring that data home so that you own it, so that you can use it later? Cloud strategy is really critical to a lot of the virtual organizations as they incept, grow, and build. The downside of the cloud strategy is the data is siloed in those systems. And so what we must do is we must figure out how can we actually take the data that we believe to be critical to our organization and bring it in-house and own it so that we're prepared to take advantage of any of it in the future. And so those are our safe bets. They're the things that we like to focus people on when we're doing our planning. We get in early and start thinking about these things, again, away from the red. I can't say away from the red enough, away from the red, because the excitement that goes on around product launch in the red, it's hard to get people's attention to focus on building the business because the product's got to get out the door. And so if we can take some thoughtful time before we get into that red and think about some of these things, it's usually pretty good. So go ahead, Lindsay.
So two of the safe bets that we're going to talk about today specifically are quality as well as serialization. And I want to jump off with the quality topic and looking at quality or regulatory. The title of this slide is Who's Driving the Bus. And what I mean by that is you often see people that have, both in their title. And quality and regulatory are often lumped together, but they're uniquely different. I like to describe regulatory as, the requirements or the steps between your company and being able to launch your product, registering with the FDA, getting ready for serialization, whereas quality is all about the consistency and the reliability of the data that's being gathered to meet those regulatory requirements. Quality should be process driven, and it can be enhanced anytime by systems or solutions or technology. But that's not necessary. It's not a prerequisite. You want to build to that and you want to plan for that. And that's one of the safe bets that we really help people manage from strategy through sustainability. So serialization is most definitely a regulatory driver. We call it a burning platform. It's one of those safe bets that you got to take care of early on, or it could affect your ability to launch product. But again, there's that convergence with quality because serialization is easier when you have the right quality processes and systems in place. You don't need to recreate the wheel here. A lot of this stuff has been done already. A lot of it's the 80-20 rule, but you do have to have formal documentation of these processes, and you need to plan for implementing the right systems for any combination of vendor selection and audit processes. This goes for both any technology vendors that you're bringing in, but as well as supply chain partners, quality agreements. Probably everybody on the phone is using contract manufacturers and 3PLs for distribution. So being able to negotiate and then guarantee the level of quality that you're getting from your partners. Change controls. I like to joke with our quality folks that this is process for processes, but it really is. It's documenting, what changes, why it changes to validated systems as well as established quality processes. Document management, whether you're using a SharePoint site or you're looking to implement a true electronic document management system, what are your processes around document management, security, version control, all that fun stuff. Validation and SDLC, I'll kind of group those together, especially with the emergence of cloud technologies for a lot of virtual manufacturers and biotech companies. You need to understand with a lot of these softwares in the cloud, there's an ongoing validation component to it. And there's also a development life cycle that you need to understand, you need to document, and you need to account for. QA, having that designated role or responsibility is important, and it can often be challenging for younger startup companies because, again, by nature, you're wearing a bunch of hats. Each person has 3, 4, 5 different hats that they wear. You can't be the reviewer and the approver of any sort of quality documentation. You need to have those checks and balances in place. So it's important that you always have designated QA oversight, and that you for any project or initiative that you're building, that you have both system owners and business owners that are identified to support that. The sooner the better to establish a training program with role-based curriculum. And then we talked about, or I had mentioned earlier, having an actual solution or a technology in place. So that's where you get to a true QMS. It's not necessary, but it can be a vehicle to present that data that could accelerate or make a regulatory submission more secure or stronger. And that includes electronic document management systems, training, clinical and quality modules. And there's a lot of those out there. And then finally, quality processes to capture both exceptions as well as the happy path. So whether it's having quality, being able to guarantee quality of your incoming raw materials, having processes in place where you're reaching out to your CMOs from a sampling perspective for in-progress manufacturing, understanding what their process is for sampling to guarantee quality, which ties back to those quality agreements. And then what happens when you have exceptions? How are those documented? How are those handled? Do you have appropriate CAPAs in place for after the fact? Again, this is all part of a holistic quality strategy. The sooner you have these foundational building blocks in place, the easier it's going to be to address new systems and technologies or challenges such as serialization, which is one of the things that's between you and launch. So want to take a quick look at our methodology. We call it strategy through sustainability. Regardless if we're talking about a quality project or a serialization project, an ERP project, we follow the exact same methodology. And I just from talking with Brian and from working with SVA, I know these folks do the same. It's about understanding, where you're at, what you need to do, where you're going, and all the steps to get you there. So we follow strategy through sustainability. Strategy is outlining those user requirements, those business requirements, being able to build the plan. And, we're talking serialization. That's just a subset of the larger commercialization strategy that SVA does. So when we look at serialization specifically, right, a normal serialization strategy from a planning perspective takes about 6 to 8 weeks. We like to call it budget and buy-in. It's really important because a lot of times if you haven't experienced serialization, a lot of people think, oh, this is just an IT issue or this is just a manufacturing issue. And then again, someone gets the serialization hat. But until you get true buy-in from the stakeholders, they're never going to understand, that it does touch every segment of your business, and you're never going to get the appropriate budget in order to ensure that you take care of this before or as you get into the red zone, as opposed to scrambling last minute, because as you'll see a little later, you can only do so much once you get into crunch time. The actual heavy lift can be anywhere from 6 to 9 months, best case scenario. And again, a lot of this is out of your control, which is why it's important to start early. A lot of this is dependent on the supply chain partners that you choose, their capabilities, as well as, frankly, where you're at on their priority scale, because there's lots of people that are scrambling to get this done. Everybody's in the red zone at different times, and a lot of these contract partners have been in the red zone now for the past year and will continue to be so as more and more people get serialization ready. So it's important to understand that and what the interdependencies are. So, from a planning perspective, you should be starting at least 12 to 18 months before your expected approval from a serialization perspective. And then with every project, we always have an ongoing sustainability model, whether it's an internal center of excellence. We have something called Service Bureau that allows for outsourced sustainability. Again, it handles ongoing validation. It handles administration from a managed services perspective of serialization systems, quality management systems, you name it, we can support it, or we can help you build the internal infrastructure from a center of excellence perspective to support it. At a high level, a serialization strategy, like I said, 6 to 8 weeks. The first 2 weeks is all about data collection and planning. We're going to do on-site visits, discovery. This is a big piece of this is educating all the major stakeholders. So again, whoever has the serialization hat, we'll often engage with initially, but the whole point of us coming on site is, talking to the regulatory group, talking to the quality group, helping them understand that there's a massive change management piece to this, talking to IT, talking to whoever's in charge of third-party operations, right? So we need to collect your current as is, and then we take a couple weeks to look at the 2Bs, right? So what are the process flows for both your product and your data, right? You need to understand how both are going to flow. Supply chains are evolving from a structure perspective with, specialty pharma, specialty distribution, cold chain products, right? So depending on, as you map out that supply chain strategy and that supply chain network, that could influence what decisions you make for serialization. And then the data is the serialization that's going to follow that. Corresponding user requirements. So anytime you buy any technology, you should have a URS that defines the requirements so you're properly evaluating the vendors. Validation plan that would tie back into hopefully you have an existing, validation SOP. How do you guys handle SDLC and validation in general? And then our team builds a validation plan as a subset of that. Business requirements document. This is an important one. And I'll go into this in a little more detail later, but again, this helps you manage your relationship with your trading partners, your CMOs and your 3PLs. If you don't tell them what you expect, especially from a serialization perspective, they're going to do what's easiest for them, which may not be what's best for you. So the sooner you communicate that and frankly use it as part of your upfront negotiation and selecting those partners, which is another reason why it's good to get the strategy out of the way early. 18 months, even as early as 24 months ahead of time, so you know what you're looking for in a business, in a supply chain partner, because it helps with the negotiations and it helps with the evaluations. And then ultimately a resource plan and an integrated project plan, so you know what the actual expected effort is when it's time to say go, right? So again, just because you don't have to roll right into implementation, but if you understand what your budget is and you understand how long it's going to take, it's going to allow you to plan the right way and then be ready for implementation. When you go into implementation, these are just a couple categories or subtopics, right? EPCIS, those are the serialization solutions that are out there. We've worked with all of them, but based on your user requirements, business requirements, that supply chain structure that we talked about, and then ultimately your timeline, who's the right vendor for you, right? We help you go through that process. Labeling, what needs to go where, and that may sound simple, but there's more to it than you may think if you haven't been through it before, depending again on your CMO or if you have internal manufacturing. The equipment only has certain capabilities, and then different markets, especially if you're looking to sell outside the U.S., have different labeling requirements. So, we're able to manage or support this from design through delivery. You really want to think about the validation process. Again, I said, this is a hot topic with any cloud system right now, and you've got two pieces of validation. You've got within your four walls. So again, you you purchase a QMS system, or say you have Viva Vault for electronic document management, or you have a serialization system or an ERP system, right? I can always integrate, or I can always validate that functionality within those four walls. But serialization, especially from a virtual, is meant to involve supply chain partners. So, what does that end-to-end validation look like? How are you testing that the data is going to get to your CMO, and that your CMO is going to commission the right serial numbers, send that data back, and then ultimately through your 3PL and to your downstream customers, right? So the validation is an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to implementing a serialization solution. Talked about IPP and resource plan, right? That's just telling you, hey, the expected implementation is going to take 8 months. These are the types of resources that you need. It allows you to plan and budget accordingly, and then most importantly, highlight the critical dependencies so you know what the important stage gates are, so you can manage towards them. Partner selection, readiness, and onboarding is the number one issue that delays any serialization installation, and that's the risk of waiting to start. I can't tell you how many people, you say 6 to 9 months for a serialization implementation. They say, oh man, that seems long. I know more that have taken 12 to 18 months than have taken 6 to 9 months, specifically because of partner readiness and onboarding problems or issues, right? So it's important to know what your partner's capabilities are when it comes to getting ready or getting you ready for serialization and being serialization ready themselves. And this is often one that people can get a little ahead of themselves on. So again, just calling that out, and that's what the business requirements document helps with. Market plan. If you're considering selling product outside the U.S., within the next 3 years. It's important to look at that now, because there are some synergies with the work that you could be doing to launch into the U.S. But a lot of companies that we've helped launch in the U.S. over the past 2 years, we're now actively engaged in their European and rest of world launches. Again, leveraging what we can, but then also looking at those other requirements. And the last piece, it's a piece that people don't necessarily like to talk about, or they overlook, is the change management piece. This touches all elements of your business. So you're hopefully going to have existing SOPs that would need updated and or revised to reference serialization and how it's going to transform your business operation. We have baseline templates. I said earlier, don't recreate the wheel. That we're able to support this process, and we can customize. 80% of it might be canned, and 20% of it is going to be customized based on some business decisions that you're going to make. But it's important that you get these processes and SOPs in place, and then you provide training to your team. So if there is a request for a suspect or illegitimate product, your team knows how they're going to address that request in a serialized world, how they're going to leverage the systems that they've installed, and what that looks like. That's just a good example.
Thanks, Scott. Coming back a little bit to our commercialization journey, and remember, the serialization process that Scott's discussing happens inside the bounds of what we're talking about. So it would be one very detailed piece that kind of demonstrates the complexity of just one work stream that you have to put together as you're looking at this commercialization journey. Thankfully, we have exceptional organizations like Excellis that know how to do this cold and actually have pre-built templates for your consumption and use. It can actually greatly reduce the pressure and anxiety around getting to market. We do some of those same things when it comes to implementing our financial controls. And Lindsay, if you want to go ahead and build out the slide, I think there's 2 more steps. I'll talk to it. So when we take a look at how we deal with our financial controls, we really have some triggers that we want to focus on. We want to make sure that we understand that we're in a prepared state when we have cash infusions or IPOs. And what we want to do is we want to set up the back office with confidence, so that people can really demonstrate the right controls and procedures to those that are investing or to the street. We also know that when you're pre-revenue, you're still going to have needs around clinical, and you have pre-commercial needs. And we want to make sure you have systems that can do that. And then, of course, we want to prepare for that success ultimately with business growth and complexity. To do this much the same way, we have pre-built templates, SOPs, and processes that can help you really set up that business infrastructure or architecture correctly. And those are going to be things that are going to help you with your financials. They're going to be things that are going to help you with your procure-to-pay discipline, which can be a bit of a problem and a challenge for some people. Obviously, inventory and materials management will be able to focus because that'll be part of how we get product out. But you're going to need FP&A, your financial planning and analysis, to make sure that you understand your trajectory and understand your cash needs as you go forward. And of course, what does that actually look like to investors as you're planning out your success arc? And then obviously, sales and operations have to plug into this. And you'll need to make sure that there are systems for those activities to actually make sure we're tracking correctly. There may be compliance reasons around Sunshine Act, those types of things. We have to accommodate that. And then all of that may incept in different places, which is something we talked about before. And we want to make sure we can grab that information and have it, long term. So building off of pre-built processes, building off of the experience of others is a really great way to think about getting best practices into your organization. So go ahead, Lindsay.
So the serialization journey is, again, a subset of the commercialization journey. And I'm not even going to try to get into this in any level of detail other than to highlight the fact that it's a heavy lift and it's heavier than most people think, because it involves you as a manufacturer. It involves your supply chain partners. It involves the vendor that you select. And there's certain critical paths that need to be met. So again, the sooner you can start, the better. You get that buy-in and budget from the key stakeholders, plan accordingly, and then you can work on executing against a plan similar to this. Everyone always wants to assume best case scenario, right? But kind of plan for the worst and hope for the best is how we like to roll these out. So, if you're 9 months away from launch, I'm hoping that we started the program, 6 months earlier, as opposed to, okay, I'm just going to work backwards. They said it's going to take 9 months. Let's start 9 months before, because this needs to be done, months ahead of launch. You're going to want to have this completed and have all the I's dotted and T's crossed.
And so this is kind of how we see getting there. This is the planning process that takes us through launch and actually beyond. So what we like to do is we like to come in that era of safe bets, way away from the fire, and we like to take a look at what is kind of our readiness assessment or readiness awareness. We want to make sure that we understand where the organization currently sits before we start prescribing what things need to be done, because everybody's going to have different things in various states of completion very early on to support what they're doing. In that time frame, we'll take a look at those safe bets, making sure we're ahead of the game and not behind as we go forward. Then we're going to take a look at, really when we're starting to prepare for launch, we've gotten a little bit more positive news. Then we're going to really look at what is that full state readiness. And what we're going to do is we're going to plan for readiness, which means we're going to punch holes like crazy in the team's belief system of what's in place and what's not in place. It's our job to challenge and to make sure that we're pressure testing the plan that exists. And it's our job to make sure that we're very, very honest, transparent, and direct about any weaknesses we see. That's just to make sure we are all as ready as we possibly can to go forward. And then it gets really interesting, because one of the things that I believe is difficult for an organization to do is when someone yells go, and you got to run, you got 9-11 months to go. Now you got to switch from that R&D mode to we're going to get to market, and that mobilization means everybody's got to get up and running in a cadence to make sure things get built correctly. That's the point with which resources get deployed. And by resources, I mean you're going to be spending more cash in that time frame. You're going to be signing up more partnerships in that time frame with outside providers, and you're going to be taking your internal resources. You're going to have lots of hiring going on. You have to blend teams. You're going to have people who own multiple spaces that are going to then fold into just kind of single line ownership of a function. There's a lot that happens in the mobilization period that actually can really tear at an organization's culture and can actually put risk inside of that red period. And then what we'll do is we'll do a launch ready date and assessment, before that launch ready moment. And we'll do a kind of a dry run, making sure that everything's in place, all the systems connect, making sure we're doing testing through it and feel good about it. And of course, we'll find some things that we need to firm up and harden. That's the whole point of that process. But we're there to make sure we're punching holes in the plan, and then we'll get to market and we'll have a happy day. And we'll get product into patients' hands very quickly. That's the goal, is trying to get patients product shipped as early as possible. So that's the commercialization journey. We have a kind of a method or approach of walking people through it. And we've got listed things we make sure we do, but we have lots of methods around managing the change and managing, all the influx of new people and new ideas as we're trying to get the company launched. Okay, go ahead, Lindsay.
So we're going to wrap up with some questions and answers, but real quick before we get to that, because we did have a couple submitted before the webinar, just wanted to point out if anyone has further questions or would like personalized follow-up meetings, you can reach out to Andrew DeMarco at SVAconsulting.com or Joe Roy at ExcellisHealth.com. And their email addresses are there, and we'll be able to share the deck afterwards. And you can always, find Brian and I on LinkedIn or reach out to us direct or through Andrew and Joe. The point is we're happy to engage with you guys further and welcome the outreach. Also wanted to let you know, if you want to visit or see us in person, we are hosting or co-hosting 2 events together. Excellis has run an industry consortium called Global Track and Trace now for at least 6 or 7 years. The point of Global Track and Trace, and it has become a lot about serialization, because serialization is and has been the hottest topic in supply chain since the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, DSCSA, went into effect in 2013. But the original intent of Global Track and Trace, and we're trying to bring it back to its roots, is that we're bringing together all segments of the supply chain, because that's our perspective and that's our lens that most people don't see. Whereas, a lot of biotech manufacturers don't necessarily talk to the end customers, the specialty pharmacies or the retail pharmacies or the hospitals and healthcare networks that are buying and administering their products, or they don't understand, exactly how the wholesaler's working in the middle and, what their role is in that entire process. And there's very rarely, if ever, do you have all 3 segments, manufacturer, along with CMOs and 3PLs, right? Wholesalers, as well as, the dispensers, as DSCSA calls it, but your healthcare and your retail and specialty pharmacy systems in the room together, talking about supply chain challenges. It could be serialization, but it could be quality, it could be brand protection. There's lots of components to it. And again, we're trying to expand that conversation a little bit to really touch on some of the quality aspects and the commercialization readiness aspects that we talked about today. Because let's face it, if you're more ready to launch your product, it's going to be better for the wholesaler, it's going to be better for the dispenser, and it's going to ultimately be better for the end consumer. So again, we have these live events. You're going to hear customers speak. You won't hear Brian and I up there. We're going to have customers speak to their serialization journeys, to their commercialization journeys, lessons learned, emerging new regulations, people that are getting ready to go to Europe. There's going to be all kinds of good material there. So if you guys are local and able to join us, San Diego, San Francisco, you'll see an invite very soon from our team with a detailed agenda and the ability to register. And then we should be doing a similar event in Boston at some point later in 2019. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay with some of the questions that came in ahead of time and any questions that have been submitted since we started the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Brian. So we're going to kick off the questions section of the presentation. Just as a reminder, you can submit questions at any time while we go through these previously submitted questions, so don't be afraid to submit those in the questions pane. The first question I'd like to kick over to Brian is, can you describe the importance of having the executive team engaged in the commercial launch efforts from the beginning to end? What are some of the risks that may surface if the level of engagement trails off?
Wow, that's a great question. A couple of things. First of all, I think it's critical. Executive sponsorship is really critical, and the executive sitting in what we call the integrator role, or making sure that they're facilitating, information and decisions between people that might be in conflict is really critical to get the organization in that mobilization step and getting them forward. What ends up happening if the executive sort of pulls away from the launch team, and sometimes they have to, but if they pull completely away, what you'll see is new people will come in, and then depending on personality, the more dominant voices begin to win. And that may not be exactly what the executive either wants or what's best for the organization. So having executive sponsorship and having them actively engage with making sure they're integrating the organization, especially the new players that are coming in, to make sure that the organization doesn't drift off the pathway set, is critical throughout the life of launch. And we can talk it offline if anybody's interested, but we've got some examples and stories that we can talk about that show that. Second thing I would say there too is, one thing we see quite a bit is decisions get like unmade and remade. So if there's not a good decision log, and there's not a good, here's why it was done and who made the decision, and it wasn't an executive sponsored decision, a new stakeholder can come in and they'll undo the decision, and we'll go down a different path. Even to the point where you had duplicative spend, where you have competing systems that have been contracted, those types of things. So some real dangers there. So thank you for the question.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So we've had another few questions that could be coupled together. So just some key roles that must be retained within the organization and not be outsourced, I guess, in regards to virtual organization. Who would like to field this one? And the specifics is a rare orphan drug.
Okay. Well, I can take a swing at it. Maybe Scott can pin in. For me, I would think off the top of my head, anything that's really essential to brand, like preservation of brand, protection of brand, propagation of brand, the things that are really critical to that organization becoming known in the marketplace. So things like market access, things like medical affairs, those are going to be things that really kind of set the position of the product, set the position of the company's brand. Those are things that I think you want to have in-house. And then head of quality, head of regulatory, because that's all about brand preservation and making sure that you've got, great compliance and great quality product that's being put out to the street. So that'd be my answer. I don't know, Scott, if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, I was going to 100% say, quality assurance and regulatory for all the reasons I talked about earlier, right? And then supply chain, which might be counterintuitive because we're a supply chain consulting company, right? So we'd love to do that work, but we want to do that work with you guys and not instead of you guys, right? So the idea is you need to have a strong supply chain leader that understands how all these pieces fit together and is, comfortable asking for help where your organization may not be strong, because, a virtual by definition does outsource a lot of these core competencies. So, knowing where to ask for help and when is important, and you'll get that if you have a strong supply chain leader.
Great. Thank you. So it looks like we have one last question, and here we go. So I'd like to know what good IT looks like across pre-commercial to full commercialization. I think maybe do you want to kick off to Brian?
Sure. Good IT. It's interesting. I think what's happening inside the world of IT is obviously changing dramatically by cloud technologies and the people who are building things like software as a service. So many of the traditional sort of maintenance and hygiene functions that would occur inside of an IT organization are really done by those people that run these cloud systems. So it may not be, your typical IT structure, but what you're going to need are people that can really understand, what the business requires. So business analysts, people who understand how to manage, vendor environments, understand how to manage vendor relationships, understand to do system selection. I think a lot of times, especially in virtual organizations, you're seeing organizations go from IT doers to IT leaders and thinkers and selectors and processors as they're leveraging these, kind of modern ecosystems. So I think that's probably what good IT looks like. I think IT may be selected as the steward of organizational data. If they are, then I think they need to really focus on data ownership, data management, and making sure that the organization has an asset that they can lever into the future. Sometimes that data asset is actually managed by someone like a chief data officer if the organization's really focused on their data. Sometimes it can be inside an analytics group, and sometimes it can live everywhere. But if IT is the steward over data, I think focusing on a data lake concept where you can store transactions from all time, and then you have the ability to do some data science on it at some point. I think that's pretty critical right now. And actually, the cost is not that great considering what you get. So hope that's a good enough answer.
Yeah, and it looks different for everybody, right? Good IT also depends on what your end goal is. If you're looking to build your brand and grow, you may have more of a runway. Whereas if the plan is to ultimately get gobbled up, and have an acquisition of some sort, you may want to put systems in place that may seem like overkill up front, but it makes you more attractive to the folks that may be shopping around and looking at your company. So there's, again, it kind of speaks to the reason why Brian and I both have companies, right? Is the idea of helping you plan out what that future state is and what those future business requirements are, and then ensuring that you have the right processes in place, and then ultimately the right technologies to support that vision.
Yep, agreed.
Great. So it looks like that concludes the questions for today's presentations. Again, feel free to submit any questions to our presenters after the webinar, and we will have a full recording available after the webinar concludes. So with that, I'd like to thank Scott, and I'd like to thank Brian and the SVA team, and everyone for attending today's webinar. So on behalf of Excellis Health Solutions and SVA, have a great rest of the day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. It's our pleasure.
Thank you. Take care.